equally amazing authors. So, yeah. That awkward moment where I'm just like, all right, just come in. Okay, I think that is enough time. But hi, everyone, and good evening and Happy New Year. So, my name is Isa, and I am a bookseller at Politics and Prose, and I will be your host tonight. And I'd like to welcome you to PNP Live. Thank you for joining us in this virtual format amid these extraordinary times, throughout all of which we strive to continue to bring you the authors that you love and their new books to our Politics and Prose community. At any point during the event, you can click on the link in the chat to purchase Yonder by Jabari Asim on the Politics and Prose website. It is beautiful. And fun fact that I learned tonight, this art is by Jacob Lawrence. And you can ask the author a question by clicking on Q&A, which can be found near the bottom of your screen. And while we'll try to get to everyone's questions after this presentation, we apologize in advance if we don't have time to address yours. And finally, we want to thank you all for being here with us tonight. We are so thankful for our community of loyal customers and friends for keeping our business and our spirits afloat. So it is now my pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers. Jabari Asim is a writer and multidisciplinary artist. He currently directs the MFA program in creative writing at Emerson College, where he is also the Elma Lewis Distinguished Fellow in Social Justice. An accomplished poet, playwright, and writer, Jabari Asim has been described as one of the most influential African-American literary critics of his generation. Asim has served as the editor-in-chief of Crisis Magazine, the NAACP's flagship journal of politics, culture, and ideas, and as an editor at the Washington Post, where he wrote a syndicated column on politics, pop culture, and social issues. He is the author of 7 books for adults, including We Can't Breathe on Black Lives, White Lies, and the Art of Survival, and 11 books for children. His debut book of poems, Stop and Frisk, was published in 2020. Jabari will be joined tonight by Kiese Laymon. Kiese is a Black Southern writer from Jackson, Mississippi. Laymon is the author of the genre-bending novel Long Division and the essay collection How to Slowly Kill Yourself and Others in America. Laymon's best-selling memoir, Heavy, an American memoir, won the 2019 Carnegie Medal for Excellence in Nonfiction, the 2018 Christopher Isherwood Prize for Autobiographical Prose, the Austin Riggs Erickson Prize for Excellence in Mental Health Media, and was named one of the 50 best memoirs of the past 50 years by the New York Times. He is the founder of the Catherine Coleman Literary Arts and Justice Initiative, a program aimed at getting Mississippi kids and their parents more comfortable reading, writing, revising, and sharing. Friends, it is my absolute honor to introduce Jabari and Kiese to PNP Live.
Oh, thank you for that really sort of super generous introduction to me, family. I'm so glad to be here with you, Jabari. You know, there's nothing really great to talk about over COVID, but one of the treasures has been really being able to have these conversations with like my literary idols. And you are definitely one of them. Before we got on here, I said, like, you are the writer in this world more than any other writer where I never know what you're gonna do. Like if somebody's like, did you read Jabari's new book? The shit could look like 18 different books, you know? And so before we get into Yonder, fam, like, which is to me feels like, as someone who's read everything you've written, I want to make the claim that you might have needed to write all of that to make this. I don't know if that claim can be substantiated, but I would love for you to like let us hear you read it for a few minutes before we get into our conversation, if that's okay.
Oh yeah, I'd be happy to. First, I want to say, thanks to Politics and Prose for inviting us to have this conversation. Thanks to Isa for the wonderful introduction, and thanks to you for agreeing to do this. We talked about it before we went live, that we had a similar conversation, I guess a couple years ago. It was pre-pandemic. You and I at Emerson College, when you came and shared your work with our students, and it was just a really wonderful experience. I'm glad that we're able to connect again in this way. So I will, so first of all, I'll just say a little bit about Yonder. It takes place in 1852. It involves a group of people who are in captivity, people whose ancestors came from Africa. And it's really about their attempts to sustain loving relationships in the midst of hellish circumstances. So one of the difficulties of reading from this book aloud, I was looking for a passage to read. It's difficult to find passages I can read without spoiling things, right? So I think I have found a particular passage. And involves a character named Sarah, who is waiting to be transported from one plantation to another. The man who is taking her is an overseer named Holtzclaw, who is bad news, and she knows he's bad news. So that's the setup. So I'll begin. Having helped himself to Silent Mary's baked goods without offering Sarah so much as a nibble, Holtzclaw deduced that he had been perhaps too hasty in his consumption. Midpoint between Placid Hall and Two Forks, his stomach had grown angry and demanded relief. He halted the wagon at the side of a tree-lined road, climbed down and hurried into a thicket of vines. Sarah could see the top of his head as he squatted and grunted. She could also see a rock, substantial yet handy, on the ground between him and the wagon. She studied it, imagining what she could do with it and calculating the speed and stealth she'd need to cover the distance. Slowly, quietly, she swung her legs over the side of the wagon. Before she could lower her feet to the ground, a flicker of motion in the trees above her head made her pause. She looked up and saw, crouching on a branch, a creature from another world. It rested on one haunch, the other leg fully extended along the length of the branch, with both arms stretched upward and grasping an overhead limb. The being's clothes were made to resemble bark, enabling it to blend almost seamlessly against its background. Most striking was its face, in broad strokes of brown and green painted so closely together that no flesh showed. Was it a haint? An angel? Sarah was too awestruck to hazard a guess. Without losing balance, the creature folded an elegant arm and placed a finger to its lips. Sarah nearly gasped when the creature leaped and landed gracefully on silent feet. It squatted and, securing Sarah's attention, drew in the dirt with its index finger. After making sure Sarah saw the marks it made, it rubbed them away. Quick as death, it scampered up a tree and returned to its perch. His bowels settled, Holtzclaw came back to the wagon and noticed the glow on Sarah's face. He chuckled to himself, concluding that her radiance was a sign of the excitement he assumed he aroused in stolen winches. Sarah lived to experience even more surprises, but none as wondrous as her encounter with the mystical figure that swooped down from the trees. She knew then that she would always remember the angel's marks in the dirt, even if she never learned to make sense of them. The cryptic letters burned in her memory as if they had been written in flames. In due time, the words read. Now stop it right there.
Okay, one of the questions one of the statements I wanted to make to the audience before we even got on it was like, I don't think you will read the words in due time the same way after reading. I had no idea you were going to read that passage.
Oh.
But fam, I want to talk and start, if we can, with language. And
Sure.
I also want to encourage you all, if you have questions, or those fake questions that are like answers that you want to ask Jabari, please throw them in the question and answer, and we'll try to get to them and make it as organic as possible. While this book is at once, to me, an exploration of the way folks we used to call the enslaved use love and words to explore love, sounds of words, multiple meanings of words. It's also a book where you necessitate that the audience use different words to describe the people, right, that are populating this art object. and you call these people the stolen. And I want to talk about that move before we start to talk about the ways all of these different characters utilize language and come at language from particular portals of entry to create a book that is as much about the enslavement of and joyful and the joy created in spite of enslavement and freedom in spite of enslavement, but it's also, again, just about words and the multiplicity of words. So can we talk about why you came up with the idea of like the stolen as opposed to something else?
Yeah, I mean, like you know, I'm really fascinated with language. I'm fascinated with the different roles and functions of language in our communities. And I wanted to come up with language that kind of reflected a dual reality. You know, there's the oppressors regarding us one way, and us regarding ourselves quite another way. At the same time, being required to use language that protects us from their worst impulses, right? So we have sequences where they speak in sort of a broken tongue, that on one level assuages their oppressors, but also misleads them, right? It's like never let the oppressor know how much you know, how smart you are, what you're thinking about, etc. Right? So language has to constantly be this shield and this instrument at the same time. And so I wanted to sort of play with the idea of, not necessarily a moral judgment, but there's this tendency to portray colonized and captured people as regarding their oppressors as deities or superior beings, right? And it's clear that these captured people believe they hold the moral high ground, as it were, because these people are amoral hypocrites. No matter what, they might elevate democracy and these other principles, but they steal people. Right. They steal people. They steal people. They steal people. So and I thought it would be interesting if the captive population, if their language reflected that acknowledgement, that recognition.
And one of the things you also do is that early on, you do this thing with time where you give the stolen historicity, right? Like the stolen have elders that they refer to as elders. That's an ill move right there in and of itself. But early on in the book, you have William say, our elders taught us that words were mighty enough to change our condition. And, growing up in Mississippi, which in some way was, could be argued as the home of a kind of informed, sincere verbosity via Fannie Lou Hamer, a lot of other people. But I remember when I was in the late 80s, I remember hearing people be like, man, I don't want to hear about rhymes and words. We can't eat those, right? Like we can't eat rhymes. We can't eat words. But I want actually you to push back against this claim that it's not like you're saying organization isn't as important as words or education. But why was it important for you as the writer to have a character make the claim early in the book? Our elders taught us that words were mighty enough to change our condition. And it goes from William to Cato to Margaret. Like they all do different stuff with words, but you let us know early on that this is a book about the stolen and their words. Could we talk about that a bit?
Right, and there's intellectual dissent within that community, right? Because William is skeptical, right? He's like, whatever you tell him, his first impulse is always going to be to doubt it, right? Yes. And Cato, his brother in arms, he's much more faithfully inclined, right? So he's like, if the elders said it, then it's real, right? So let's accept. There's no need to interrogate that, right? But so part of the influence there, when I was in college, I stumbled on a lot of writings coming out of Black cultural workers in Chicago, and they introduced the concept of nomo, or the power of words to affect physical change, right? And I was always just like totally intrigued with that. And I said, somehow, that's going to manifest itself in this story at some point. What can we actually do with language? So that's one of the arguments. It's like James Brown had that phrase, "You're just talking loud and saying nothing," right? Yes. So that's like useless language, right? But then there's other language that can do things for you, can open doors, etc.
Absolutely.
And so I wanted that's part of the reasons why I had multiple narrators, right? Because I wanted each of them to represent sort of an approach to language, right? And
Yeah.
how to come at this common problem they've arrived at, which is that we have found partners that we want to be with, but it's not up to us who we get to be with,
Oh.
or how long we can be with that person, right? So what are the weapons that are at our disposal? One of them is language.
And if we extend like that idea of Nomo, and which is that was the name of the Black Lit magazine when I was at Oberlin. It was Nomo. But you know, Cato, who is a bit, well, a lot less skeptical, talks about the rules, right? He says, I continue to recite the rules to calm myself, finding a comfort in the wonder and power of language that sustains me to this day. And so to write this book, of course, you have to anticipate folks being, you know, some people being critical or cynical of the notion of us using their quote unquote language to free us. Can you jump? I mean, the book I think actually is an answer to that question, but can you just give a little bit of a sound to like that you know?
Yeah, sure. So it's like you know, when before they even talk about how they're going to respond or resist to the situation, they find themselves. And William says he says a couple of things to Cato when they have a conflict that they need to resolve with their captors. You know, he says it's all in the telling. Right. It's all about how we tell this. We can shape this narrative, right? And the other thing he says to Cato is the worst thing that a thief can say to you is, let me tell you a story.
Right.
and when they begin with that, just run. It's over. Yeah. So I want to kind of introduce this idea of weaponized language.
Yes.
You know, going in both directions, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you know, and I think the big question that I feel like you sort of answered and sort of lacerated me for asking, like after reading this book. And it's this question that I mean, I don't know. I feel like only Black writers get the question about, like, you know, we're in this country because we were stolen. And then motherfuckers be like, why y'all want to write about being stolen? You know what I mean? Like, well, because they stole us, right? But how do you deal with the critique from dutiful reading Black people who say, I want to talk about quote unquote trauma in a second later, but I think it's tied to this question, who say, I don't want to read no more about slavery. I think there's some beautiful answers to that question, but I want to know what your answer to that question is.
Yeah, well, a couple of them. I mean, one, you know, Charles Johnson wrote this essay some years ago saying, you know, let's not write any more novels about slavery. Right. That's been done. And you know, my response at the time was, oh man, now I have to write one.
Exactly.
Because you just told me what I can't do, you know, and I'm very respectful to my elders, I think, you know, but you know, one thing I don't want to do to people younger than me is say, you can't write about this. Don't write about that. You know, it's like the kiss of death, right? So on one level, I didn't think that was a viable thing to say because we've barely touched, you know, this treasury of experiences, right? We barely touched it. So that was one thing. And the second thing was, I said, okay, I do want to anticipate the responses of people who are going to say, oh man, it's a slavery story. So I said, well, let's not talk so much. We do have to set up the circumstances of the confinement. But what I want to focus on is the ways that we resisted it. Right. So, but I felt I had to set it up first to show what they were resisting, and they're not passive victims, right? They're constantly employing their ingenuity to make a completely irrational situation survivable.
Yes, and did the setup in the making of the book come after you wrote the like when you said it, when you say the setup or the construction, like you had to give us, you know, some of the, or a lot. Actually, I mean, the book starts with horror. You had to give us a little bit of contextual horror before, but like when you were making it, did you start with the horror, or did you start later on?
I started with it because I started with William's voice and his earliest memories, right? Okay. And so just part of the preparatory reading, I reread Douglas's 3 memoirs. I was very influenced by a man who escaped enslavement named Lewis Clark, who had written a thin memoir. I read it like multiple times. So that was like really in my head, the way these guys were thinking
Right.
in these situations. And in both instances, they talk about memories a lot. You know, my earliest memory
Yeah.
involved this, my earliest memory involved that. So I wanted to start there just to kind of, you know, just I'm showing how they are responding to being in hell. And
Yeah.
I wanted to, but you know, even an elder character challenges that when William says, "I'm in hell," and he's like, "No."
Nah. Right.
He's like, "Don't even use that language, because
Right.
hell is their word. It's not ours,
Right.
right? So
Right. Right.
let's not do that. Let's not do
Yeah.
that, William." Right? And he's like, So you know, so I wanted that constant, those challenges to take place. You know.
Absolutely. And you know, like I think about this question of, I mean, I get this a lot about trauma, and people use the word, the phrase trauma porn. I'm not really sure what people mean by that. But I wonder, as a Black cultural worker making art in 2022 now, how much does the critique of relying too much on trauma, not necessarily enslavement, but Black trauma, how much does that influence what you do and how you do it? It influences, I often want to be like, I don't care what those people, that shit influences me a lot. So I wanted to ask you, and often it influences me in ways that aren't helpful to my work, but I still have to reckon with. But I wonder, like, how you deal with that.
Well, you know, it's interesting because my editor on the project, Dawn Davis, is African American.
Yes.
And she's very familiar with the material. She's edited several novels that address this period, right?
Right.
The Known World, Yellow Wife. You know, she's got a shelf of so you know, I knew that going in. You know, okay, Dawn knows this material as well as I do. And it was interesting. One of the conversations we had, originally, she wanted me to reduce the incidence of violence in the draft, and you know, we went back and forth, and ultimately I did. But then she came back to me and said, "You know, I've been thinking about this."
That's so word. Yo, you never hear that. I've never heard that from an editor.
Yeah,
like,
She
said, that's incredible.
She said, maybe you should put some of that back.
Can you talk at all about why she thought that?
I think she had revisited, you know, because like I say, she's done the reading, right?
Right.
You know, so that was part of the conversation, and it was almost like, okay, you know, I've been looking over the literature, I've been looking over the history, and you actually didn't go overboard with that, right? So
I got you.
But that said, I put some things back, but it still didn't have as many incidents as my very first draft.
Yes.
And you know, this is ironic because it's another manifestation of the word of the title of your memoir, heaviness, right? So this you know, I've gotten responses. Some of this material is heavy, and I have to say, well, that experience was heavy.
A little bit.
People were stolen. I do want to make clear what involved the circumstances of theft, right?
And I think what you do so well, Jabari, is that a character like Xander jumps off the page into our heart, into our heads, sleeping with us, because I think much literature and much history that we were taught makes no room for Xander. Like, Xander does not exist in most of the literature and history we read about the stolen, right? Like the enslaved folk. So talk to me about the construction of Xander and what, I mean, without giving the book away, but can you talk to me about the construction of Xander? Because Xander's pivotal, and Xander is like one of those characters you wish you had the audacity to create, and I just don't. So,
well, Xander's about 15 or 16 years old, and he's on this work crew, this pit crew with these grown men, you know, these adults. So he's young, he's slender, he's athletic, you know, having there, he's fleet of foot, he can probably outrun all of these men. Right. But he also has this boundless energy that he can't contain. And he's obsessed with flying. So when he's not working, he's running up and down the field between the cabins, practicing flight, because he says, eventually I'm going to take off. You know, you might not believe me, but you know, it's going to happen. Right. So he finds moments of joy and exuberance in the midst of, you know, everyone else being exhausted and just kind of
Yes.
worn out. And my inspiration partly for that is the art that's actually on the cover.
Yes.
It's a detail from panel number 4 of Jacob Lawrence's Harriet Tubman series, which, you know, is about Harriet Tubman overcoming the things that she had to overcome and helping people do it. But he has this one panel in the middle of it where these children are just jumping for joy. They're just flipping around. They're just having a good time in the midst of all that. And so I actually had a reproduction of that panel like on my desk when I was writing, because I wanted to remind myself, right? And I've always been struck by, you know, Ellison has this observation about artists wringing the marvelous from the terrible, right? And I thought the kids have an instinct to do that, you know, without sophistication, and that's what Xander's doing. He finds these marvelous moments in the midst of the terrible.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's almost these are not your words, but it felt to me like Xander was perpetually practicing to be free. You know, like
I like that. I like
perpetual
that.
practicing.
Yeah.
But I feel like this book is so much about the practice of language, of routine, of love making. You know, like there's a lot of body, a lot of sex, a lot of like the practice of sexuality and sensuality is so thick throughout this book. But I want to talk for a second also about like voice, like the sound of the words that we hear in this book. Later on in the book, Margaret writes about Sarah. Sarah's voice was not lovely, but it was strong. It never wavered as she sang of home. And I also feel like sometimes when you write, I don't know, like that sentence to me is like a beautiful, brilliant sentence that reads as if it is not written by a writer, but reads as if it is written by someone who listens to the sounds of words and voice and stuff. But talk to me also about like the sound of the words in this book, as heard by the stolen, as opposed to just like the functionality of the word.
Right. Sure. And I mean, I really wanted to play with that. Like I said, I'm you know, my background is in poetry. My early pieces, my earliest publications are all poetry. Right. So I've always been kind of fascinated, and also just the musicality of our language never ceases to astound me from day to day. And I told my wife one of my favorite memories is years ago we lived in St. Louis, and I rode this bus, and I was an editor at a book production company, and everybody else on this bus was a blue collar brother who worked like in the hotels, right? They like, you know, they did the maintenance, and they had these really loud, boisterous arguments about sports and politics, and I would just sit there and just like soak it all in, right? Because I mean, it's almost like they're singing while they're talking, and they have all these wonderful expressions, and they insult each other, and they talk about their mothers, you know, just all kind of crazy stuff. And so I always kind of want to do, you know, pay homage to the musicality of the language, and one of the ways to do that is to give the narrators their own distinct vocabularies.
Yes.
So I worked really hard to do that. And Margaret even says that at one point. She says, I know I talk one way and Pandora talks another way.
I like that. I felt like that was like, you see what I'm doing, right?
right. And I gave them reasons for it. You know, Pandora talks their way because, you know, she's been exposed to books. So she's got a different vocabulary, right? So so I wanted the narration to reflect that.
And you know, I want to bring a few questions in, and I want to go back to, I want to talk about third. I want you to talk about third person for a second. Nancy Reading or Reading asked, can you talk a bit about the 7 words? I've never heard of that before. Where'd that come from?
So she's asking about one of the spiritual practices of the characters in the book. It's called whispering. And when a newborn child reaches a certain age, say if the child is a girl, there needs to be 7 people present. If the child's a girl, it needs to be 4 women and 3 men. If it's a boy, it needs to be 4 men and 3 women. And the child is passed around. The mother moves in a circle, and each of the people present whispers one word into the ear of the child. And those 7 words become the child's incantation, to be said in the morning, to be said at night, and to be said in times of crisis. And so one of the questions that I wanted to entertain for myself was, what would an alternative spiritual practice look like for these people? who are combining, indigenous practices from their elders, as well as this new stuff that they're learning about from their captors, right?
Yeah.
Or that's being impressed upon them by their captors. So the short answer is I made it up entirely. The whole practice of, because I was like, okay, I got to construct something different from, and I wanted Cato to say in moments of emphasis, I swear it on my 7 words, right?
Yes.
I wanted to say so.
Yeah.
So if you swear on your 7 words, that means your
You
word is
swear.
bond, right? Yeah,
Right.
yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Word is bond.
So and the only the only other thing that kind of influenced that was that I've read a story a couple times. I can't source it. I can't tell you where I've got it. I can't tell you if it's true or whether it's apocryphal, but a couple times in literature, I've read about an ethnic group in Africa that composes a song for each member of the group. And so your song is sung to you when you're born, and ideally you die an old man in your bed, surrounded by your loved ones who are singing you home with that same song.
Wow.
And I read that in a couple pieces, right? And I was like, I want some variation of that, right?
Right.
So I came up with the 7 words, so it's like the 7 words.
I love it, brother.
It's sort of like your amulet, So
yeah, good. I mean, this speaks to one of the questions that I wanted to ask. I wanted to make sure we get some other people's questions in, but I've said this about your work often, but one of the things I think that distinguishes you from me and from really any other writer I know is it appears that you finish every book you start, and I don't mean that as a person who's in your personal life, because I'm sure you have a ton of drafts and shit you haven't published, but I mean, we read for a living. We know books that are published that are not complete, right? And I don't think an incomplete book is a failure. I think incomplete book often are like wonders. But in this book, I felt that, like what you just talked about, the 7 words, reading that part of the book made me feel like I was reading some of your young people's books, right? Like the magic and the like, I'm just gonna create some shit out of nowhere. And
yeah.
I think that the question that a lot of people have, fam, is one, how the fuck do you write so much? Period. I just want to know that. That's my first. How do you start and finish so many different books and you don't never drop nothing that's whack? Like, that's some questions I should have talked to you about over beer, but I don't drink. So talk to me about that, fam. Like, how do you do it? And I've met you, like, you're not an antisocial brother. You know what I'm saying? Like, you make eye contact. You laugh at the right jokes and shit. Like, you're not just a fucking writing machine. But how do you do it?
I mean, well, it's like you said, you don't drink. I don't drink. I don't smoke. I have no hobbies. And I guess I'm only being partly facetious when I say I'm writing right now. I'm writing while we're talking. I'm writing all the time.
Yeah.
And I have enough of a process where I know to write it down, right? So I keep a lot of open files, right? So if a character starts speaking to me, I write. So like the major narrators in the book are what? Pandora, William, Cato, Ransom, and Margaret, right? So I had a file for each of them in my computer. And whenever Margaret says something in my head, I would just open up the Margaret file, right? Wow. And I would do that even if I'm doing something else, right? So the book on some levels kind of writing itself while I'm doing this other work, right? And so I've always done that, and I think, it's weird. Well, maybe it's not weird, but I have low blood pressure. I'm a really, I'm almost asleep a lot of the time. And so, and the more relaxed I am, the more I write.
Yeah.
Right. So if I'm just like really relaxed, I know it's gonna come, it's gonna enter. Yeah. And I just need to write it down and impose some kind of structure on it. And I worry about the structure much later. Right.
Really?
I write out of sequence. Right. So like I wrote the ending of the book pretty early. Because one time Toni Morrison said, write the ending and then write to the ending. It'll help you control the plot lines, right?
Right.
So I did that. I wrote the ending pretty early, and so I'm writing the book, and I don't know, I'm maybe 50 pages in, and I got the idea for a different ending. So I was a little conflicted because that usually doesn't happen. Once I know the
Right.
ending, I'm sticking with it. So what I did was I read both endings to my wife, and I said, I want you to pick one. And so the one
you read them out loud. You read them out
I
loud.
read them out loud to her, and the one she picked is the one that's in the book. So
That's amazing.
I said, okay, going with that one.
That's some, and one of the things, I talked about misdirection early in the conversation. And I talked to you like I just got back to my house in Mississippi. Been driving for a while, and one of the wonders of this state, which is filled with wonder, but also filled with like a lot of terrible, terrible, terrible things, is like the misdirection implicit in a lot of our language. So we still use the word yonder. I don't, but people who are not that much older than me, be like, where, blah, 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 where's Miss Cat? She over yonder. Like when my grandmama, like that is, and one of the things that you do, I mean, if there's anything that you do in this book that I hope people really, really pay attention to, I think it's the importance of the ways that multiple uses of words are also how joy is created. Right? Like yonder, if yonder was in the dictionary of the stolen, yonder might have 14 different definitions. And exactly. I wondered about that particular word, because I feel like there's some other words that might do that work, but yonder is so specific. And I also feel like if we talk about it too much, it's gonna give the book away. But can you talk a bit about picking that word and the importance of that word in the work?
Well, it really speaks to something you raised earlier about the sounds of words. I have certain words. That I really like the sound of.
Yeah.
Independent of meaning. One of them is yonder. Another one is hum. Hum is my favorite word probably in the world, right? So I got a few hums in there too. But I want the novel to operate on a certain level as a philosophical novel, right? Because I think that the philosophical impulses of Black people are just routinely downplayed or written off as something else other than intense, sophisticated speculation about their role in the cosmos, right? So what that is up against is these characters are very aware that their knowledge of the wider world is severely limited. Right. They don't know what's going on beyond the borders of this plantation. So they speculate, they debate. Well, what do you think is yonder, right? right? And I think it's this. Why I think it's that.
So dope, man.
right? So and at the same time, it operates as a metaphor for the North or the hereafter, right? All these different things that it can mean. So initially, I just had like untitled project. I didn't have a title for it, right? But once I started messing with yonder and placing it around, boy, I just really like that word, right? So so at some point it became the working title of the book. Because it has, like you said, it has so many meanings for these characters, right? And then also a gospel song that was played in my house a lot when I was coming up was Going Up Yonder. Going up yonder, right? And so I think that kind of resonated with me too.
I love it. Daniel Black, another beast at this. I don't know if you know Daniel, but Daniel.
I talked to him today.
Okay, Daniel is a beast, man. Daniel is one of those writers who scares me. But Daniel asked this question. Daniel said he doesn't know how to put his question in the question. So let me just ask.
Daniel's in the question.
Okay. Yeah, but let me ask. Daniel said, was writing, and this is a point. Like we gotta ask this question, right? Like, Daniel's question was writing. Let me go up and find it. Wait, was writing women's voices equally difficult to writing men's voices? And I want to add on to that question, like what sensory details might have been hardest to write from the women characters' POV in their narration. So I want to ask Daniel's question: was it harder to write women? But also, can you talk about the ways you kind of like? Because I felt like you did something with all of the characters and like sensoriness, not just sensuality, but like the senses that were being heightened. But can we talk about like that decision and how hard, if it was hard at all, for you to write women characters as opposed to men characters?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it was harder, and I'm not inhibited by it. My position when you're writing about characters who are unlike yourself in some way is I think you should do it. I'd rather do it poorly
Yeah.
I'd rather do it and have readers say, hey, you got that wrong. Because it's a lose-lose. You know, if you leave those voices out, then the question becomes, where are those voices?
Where are those voices?
Right? These men weren't enslaved by themselves. What were the women thinking? What were they doing?
Right.
What were they saying
Right.
to each other? Right? And so I have them have conversations where men aren't present. Right? That has to happen too. But I mean, my wife is a woman. My mother was a woman. You know what I mean? My sisters. I know lots of women. Right?
You know a few.
I know. So you know, so I think you can kind of I think you can come to an understanding of how the character should express themselves in a way that doesn't feel wrong or offensive, right? And at the same time, you know, as an African American writer writing about a certain time period, you're wary of stereotypes too.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so it is a fine line, but I was uninhibited. Also, my editor was a Black woman, right?
Great point.
Right. and I knew she would call it, right?
Great point. That's it. And I wonder, right? Like the way the intimacy, I talked about this earlier, the intimacy and the sensuality and the sex works in this book. Like it's a different book, obviously, if those characters don't exist, right? Like somehow I don't know about you, but like when I read what we call sex scenes, I'm often like, man, I wish people would remember that character development is something we also need to see in sex scenes, right? Like people just want to be, I wrote a sex scene. I'm like, well, what the fuck happened? And people are like, they fucked. I'm like, those are characters, bro. Like, you know, like something has to happen, right? And in your book, the scenes that involve intimacy, sexuality, and sex are they are developing. Like there's major development and there's major pushing back, right? Like we have to decide what we feel about certain characters while they're in the midst of it, because, you know, because you're pushing back against conventional conventions. I mean, I don't want to give too much of the book away, but I know you know what I'm talking about. But can you talk about pushing back against some of the traditional notions, but also some of the, I think, sort of scary parts of writing about sexuality of the stolen from the POVs of like cisgender men, and as it relates to sexuality, particularly.
So one of the things I guess one of the animating emotions for me and thinking about those things was urgency, because you know, all circumstances being wonderful, you might not ever arrive at a partner with whom you are like really compatible. You're attracted to that person is attracted to you, and you want to be together. I mean, that's in a best possible world. That's difficult, right? But then having it happen in a world where, you know, all bets are off, and then you have this opportunity to be together. There's some urgency here, right? Because don't know when this opportunity will ever present itself again, and the man knows that, and the woman knows that. Right. So that, and then there's also, you know, the psychology. Like William's sexuality, his sexual behavior is very controlled by his he doesn't want to have a child. He doesn't ever want to father a child, right? You know, and so that really complicates you know how he's gonna have sex, right?
Absolutely.
So that becomes, you know, an issue for him, and it becomes much more of an issue once he meets this woman. That he wants to be with, and she wants to be with him.
His body wants.
Right. And he's telling her, well, you know, I got these issues, and she's like, wait, what? You know.
let me fix that for you.
Right. So, you know, it has to be dealt with, right?
Yeah. I mean, I thought that was I mean, you know, I thought that was daring, but also just like so definitely done, because it's the stakes feel high for me as a reader and a writer, but it also felt, the intimacy in the book felt fun to read, and I don't know if that's something writers want to hear, but I think the fun came in the innovation of how you did it for me.
I mean, I wanted some playfulness there, and also I have to tell you, and I've written about this in one of my books. I've always been stung by you know, Thomas Jefferson's observations about Black people, and one of the ones that really stung was that Black people are incapable of romantic love. They only have animal sexual urges. That's all they got, right? So I wanted to have these people court, right?
Yes.
I wanted Cato to say, I got feelings for you,
I
right?
love it. I love it. I
Right.
love it.
And also, I'm in the circumstances where I don't have much materially to offer. So what can I come up with, right?
Right.
And I was very inspired by that passage in the Known World by Edward P. Jones, where the man, he carves a comb, right, out of a piece of
Yes.
wood, and he brings it to this woman that that he's affected for, and he says, "I know it's not much," and she says, "Oh, it's the whole world." Right.
So that's right. That's right.
And I remember reading that book, and I was like, "Oh man, that's the book for me." Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the way that some people call it game. Like, do you like the way do you spit game?
Yeah.
I think if you historicize that, it's. I feel like real talk. I feel like this book is an attempt at historicizing game spitting, but it's not simply looking at it from the POV of a black man spitting game, right? Like some game is being spat on these on a lot of these, bro. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
So anyway, I really, really, really love what you did with that. Here's my other question about that I wanted to ask you, and I should have asked your permission to ask this, so I hope it's okay. Do you have any want and or worry about Yonder being made into something larger, televised and or cinematic? Do you have any worry or wonder? Like, does it feel like a project that you would like to see in another medium other than literary?
Wow, man, that's a really difficult question.
Yeah.
I would be open to it, but I mean, it would really depend on the circumstances. So like, for example, that hasn't been an experience of mine, but I've seen it unfold two different ways, right? So there's one where there's an adaptation, and the person who wrote the book has nothing to do with it, and sometimes they don't want to, and they say, hey, you have carte blanche, right? Like, I just watched this adaptation of The Lost Daughter, right?
I haven't seen that.
The Ferrante, and read a lot of discussions about the screenwriter's liberties, the deviations from. So I mean, so that would be my one question, because I know a lot has to be left out.
Right.
Right. And just what would the screenwriter leave out, and would I be consulted? And that's why, it would depend on all that kind of stuff.
But when we talked last time I was in Boston, last time I was in Boston, we were talking about the stage, and like, because you were like, that's like what I heard you saying is like, that's somewhere where I'm very comfortable, like watching.
Yeah, it's true.
But so I think sometimes somebody for the first time in my life asked me the other day, maybe a month or so ago, if they could, I don't even know what the words are, but take something I made and make it for stage. Like, are your thoughts about something like Yonder being adapted to stage different than it being adapted to a screen?
Well, I think you're right. And it's good to remember that I for whatever, because I've written for the stage, I guess, and I've never written a television show or a film. I'm much less inhibited by that prospect, but probably because I'm just much more familiar with it and have some experience with it. But yeah, at stage, I'm like, but the other thing is more daunting. Yeah. The screen is more daunting for me.
And when I was in graduate school, I felt like my degree should have been called Borges, because my professors were just in love with Borges. So we had to read a lot of Borges. And this is when people were talking about, is it rememory? Is it magic realism? And so like this book, like, I think people are going to be talking a lot about the fantastical elements of it, the magical elements of it. But I'm often curious, is like, does that synonymous with Black? Just feel like it feels like such a Black book, and these Black characters do things that some people see and feel as magical or magically surreal. But what do you call like the deviation from what people assume is reality?
Well, first of all, Black people are magical.
Yes.
Right?
Okay.
I mean, the fact that we're alive and that you and I are present and having this conversation is really hard to explain, right? But the community I come from, and many of the communities I'm familiar with, we acknowledge that there is the barrier between the spiritual world and the material world is permeable. That there's some back and forth there. I mean, no matter what kind of spiritual practice a Black person has, they usually don't blink, right?
Right.
At the notion that there's some back and forth.
Right.
And so in my previous book, Only the Strong, I have a trio of female ancestors who intervene in that book.
Yeah.
So I mean, so that's kind of like my thing, because
Yeah.
I believe that ancestors intervene, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
that's something I believe. So for me, it's not a leap from reality to
Right.
depict that. It's a reflection of reality.
So if literally you're chronicling the intervention, like they intervene, like and you're
Yeah.
and your job as an artist partially is to chronicle that intervention.
Yeah, and to do justice to it.
And to do justice to it.
Yeah, and to also to not be predictable in my
Right.
depiction of it. So I wanted to make sure, you might think it's one thing, but maybe it's something else.
Yeah.
All right, let's look at that.
When we didn't talk about this last time we talked in person, but this is something that I thought about a lot more after reading Yonder, and because of so many things we talked about before. But do you have anxiety when your books come out? Like, after having written so many incredible books, is there an anxiety when your books come out? Period. And because you are so dedicated to us and you love us so deeply, do you ever worry that Black folk in mass won't get you or it?
Well, I acknowledge that, what's the word? To a certain extent, my work is an acquired taste. I acknowledge from the beginning, everybody's not going to want it. Everybody's not going to get it. At the same time, I am surprised sometimes when I create something that I think everybody's going to get. And just very, very quickly, I wrote a book called Daddy Goes to Work years ago. It's a picture book about a man who takes his daughter to work with him, inspired by my own experiences with my own beautiful daughter, right?
Yes.
And I was at a book fair, the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York, and I had a Black woman approach me, and she said, I'm an educator, and I would never buy your book. I would never share it with my students. And I thought she was teasing, so I was laughing. Oh,
right. I would be like, oh, sis,
oh, right. Oh, you're keeping me humble. I get it.
Right.
And she's, stone-faced. She said, I'm not kidding. She said, I think it sets up unrealistic expectations for students. My students, that they're going to have a loving father who's present in the home, and you've written this fantasy story, right?
Okay.
So a few hours pass, and you're not going to believe this, but a different woman approached me and said the exact same thing, and she was also a teacher. She said, I would never share this. I think this book is harmful. She actually said that to me, and that it was a humbling experience, but also kind of taught me, you can't assume that people are going to look at your work the way you look at it. I thought, oh, this is a beautiful book. I was at another book fair, and a young Black man and his child came up with that same book, and he said to me, "This is our story.
Right.
This is our." He was so excited, right? So you can't worry about it too much. You just gotta keep writing.
Yeah,
you can't control that.
You don't seem to be a creator who is bogged down by like expectations of what you will do, but you also appear to be a creator who is sensitive, like who feels, right? Like
definitely.
Like that should probably hurt a little bit, right?
Oh boy, it really stung. It really stung.
Yeah.
I mean, when I got back, from New York, my wife was like, "How'd it go?" And that's the only thing I mentioned. I didn't say I sold lots of books.
Right.
It's like I had these two encounters, and they were really, they really threw me off my game, But you shake it off, and you sit back down, and you get back to work.
In some way, I feel like Yonder also is a textbook for, I feel like hopefully, we're always in this conversation about the weight of representation, but I think the conversation has sort of shifted a bit. But I often wonder if what we do as the stolen, right? As descendants of the stolen, or as the stolen with the expectation that we represent the stolen. You know what I mean? I'm not saying that's what those women were saying, but I wonder what you do with that, with the weight and the understanding. My work is not for everybody. I mean, I want my people to read it, but everybody's not going to read it, right? Because nobody's going to read everything.
Right.
But what do you do with that weight and that expectation? Because I mean, I know you wanted those sisters to love your work, right?
I did.
And,
Oh, totally.
and I know you want those sisters and me and the gender non-conforming folk out there, Black folk especially, to feel this. But what do you do with the weight of representation? And I wonder if how we not talk enough about the weight of representation and the creation of the pleasurable. Do you know? Because sometimes whenever I feel like we're trying to like satisfy the representational urge, I often feel like we're less playful with the art, but I feel like Yonder is an example of how you must do both. Be aware of all of this world, but play in that world and and play with freedom in that world. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, well, I think my mission is slightly different when I'm writing fiction as opposed to nonfiction. And so, I think all of those things are important, but I have to say, above all those things, I want to be entertaining.
Yes.
I want to be entertaining. This is more like we're sitting around the campfire and it's my turn to talk.
Yeah.
My friend Matt Johnson has this wonderful phrase. He talks about writing literary fiction that moves. And that's what I try to do. He said that years ago, and I was like, "Oh, that's perfect." Let me write that down.
That's it, man. Because I think, I'm not gonna be assumptive, but like, I feel like I was raised on in graduate school at least, on literary fiction that if it moved, it just moved in a circle. Like, look at me like this angle, look at me like this, right? Like, but and then I remember teaching when I first started teaching. I remember my students who wanted to be literary writers. I'm like, listen, we got to write the most beautiful shit in the world, but you cannot forget causality and plot. Right, and so. Plot is a word we don't even really talk about anymore. But like, this is such a geniusly plotted book. And I wonder if you can talk about plot. I hear you saying you don't write, in order. But can we talk about the plot? Because a lot happens in this book that I think one is not going to expect. And I wonder, like, how important that is for you, plot-wise, not just in terms of character, but plot.
Yeah, well, I'm not the first to say it. Many writers have said it, but I do imagine a reader saying, or a listener saying, "And then what happened?"
And right.
And then what happened? Oh, that's nice, but and then what happened? So I'm always trying to answer that question. One thing leads to another, but I do outline the whole thing, and that helps me, structure the plot. But once I have a pretty thorough, extensive outline, then I do write out of sequence. Certain things come to me, certain dialogue comes. I'm gonna write that before I get to it actually in the story, and I'm gonna save it and put it in at the appropriate time, and that helps the flow for me. That helps me keep going. So if I know that I've written 38 pages. If I know what's supposed to happen on 39 and it's not coming to me that day, then I'll look at what's supposed to happen on page 52 and see what comes to me. So that I'm always making words at some point.
Yes, I love it. I said, Amina Wilson just said, I often wonder what people are thinking when people say things like that. I turn back the question on them and saying, should we ignore those who this applies to just because it does not apply at all? That's a great, now everybody want to come in with the questions. Last question, y'all. What is your response to the assertion that this isn't Black history, it's white history, and we're a part of their global treachery? Kind of in a vein, do you have a process for crafting dialogue from white people? Damn, 759, tough question. How do you get in their heads? Is it a struggle? You want to jump in there with that?
Oh yes, a couple things. So this is very much Black history. That's why the oppressors are thieves, right? It's strictly one point of view here. And one of the interesting choices I made is there are white characters in the novel, but they never get to tell the story.
Right.
So I hope that addresses the question in some way. There are narrative strategies you can employ that address that conundrum, I think, and that's the choice. That's the choice I made. Right? It's like they're in the story, but they're never telling it. All the versions of what happened come from us.
Family, thank you so much
for
all of your work, and but especially for Yonder. And again, y'all, if y'all haven't, please go out and get Yonder. It's one of these books. I think I want to see a lot of book clubs about this. It is as innovative on the character and line level as it is structurally and within the plot level. So Thank you so much, Jabari and Issa.
Oh,
Thank you for making this possible.
thank you, Kiese. It was a great talk.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, I wish that you guys could talk longer. And thank you both. Your talk reminded me of the necessity and radicalness of joy and magic in the face of all of the ugliness in the world. And just thank you for writing such a phenomenal book. I'm excited to dive into it. So I get to ask the last question tonight, actually. What are you both currently reading, and what would you like to suggest to our audience? It's a little past 9, but I do gotta wrap up. But
Okay.
please take your time.
Oh,
What is
I'm
on
ready.
your
You
plate?
ready, Kiese?
Yeah.
Okay, so Insurrections by
Ooh, that's a
Rian Scott.
good book. I taught that book.
Did you?
book.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Rian is wonderful. It's a fictional community called Cross River. The stories are interrelated. It's the first of his Cross River collections, and it's what I've been reading and really enjoying.
Yeah, that's a great book. That's a really great book. I reread last book I reread, and that was South to America by Monty Perry. I don't know if it's out yet. It might be out, but it might be coming out pretty soon. South to America. It is a phenomenal piece of work. So that's the book that's the last book that I reread. South to America.
Yeah, she's an amazing writer. Last time I saw her was actually in Mississippi.
Oh.
Really?
The Mississippi Book Festival.
She writes about that. She writes about it in South America. She writes about that. So you should peep that.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. I love her work. Yeah.
Yes. Thank y'all.
Thank you. Jabari and Kiese, thank you so much for your wonderful stories, your warmth, your energy tonight. Yeah, and to everyone who joined us, we appreciate you here and we appreciate you coming. Your patronage is what enables us to bring you programming like this, and we cannot continue to host these types of author talks without the book sales to support them. And you can do that by using the link in the chat to purchase Jabari Asim's Yonder. Y'all better get your hands on this. It is a wonderful book with some wonderful words, and it's got magic and beauty and love, and it's going to be great. And don't forget to check out our website for the most up-to-date event listings, as we have an amazing list to choose from. And we do hope to see everyone soon against much safer circumstances. Jabari, Kiese, thank you again for joining us this evening. And you guys were so wonderful and so great to hear and listen, and was so inspiring. And to our friends tonight, stay safe, stay warm, and stay well read. We will see you all next